He once commanded cities with a glance. But tonight, no one would even meet his eyes. Unshaven, road-worn, and wrapped in leather instead of legend, Marco Vitale entered the restaurant quietly, just another stranger with tattoos on his neck and a storm in his silence. No one recognized him. No one offered him a seat. In a room of crisp uniforms and polished cutlery, the former king of the Neapolitan underworld was invisible. He had come with no guards, no entourage, no name. Just one purpose: to see if there was anyone left in this world who could look him in the face and not flinch. Most looked away. Except her. A young waitress, half Italian, half Japanese, with soft eyes and a scholar's curiosity, broke the silence. She stepped forward, met his tired gaze, and with a gentle lilt said, "Buonasera, signore. Vuole un tavolo per uno." "Good evening, sir. Would you like a table for one?" One word. One language. One moment of dignity. It was nothing. And it was everything. Marco Vitale hadn't heard his mother tongue spoken with that kind of grace in years, not since Naples, not since the betrayal, not since the blood on the marble floors. He had not come here to be served. He had come to be forgotten. Instead, she remembered him. The girl didn't know his name. Not yet. But she saw something no one else in the room did. She saw a man, not a monster. A guest, not a ghost. And in doing so, she reached something he thought had long since died, the part of him that still believed in loyalty, respect, and second chances. He was once called Il Lupo Nero, the Black Wolf. And tonight, for the first time in years, he felt human again. Marco Vitale was not a happy man. By any measure, he should have been dead. The newspapers said he died in a warehouse fire in Palermo. His enemies celebrated. His empire crumbled. But the wolf survived. For the past 3 years, Marco had lived beneath the radar, trading crowns for silence. His name, once carved into marble and whispered in power corridors, now lived only in rumors and coded messages. He had money, yes. Influence, too. But without a family, without a future, it all felt like ash in his mouth. And lately, death had started to feel more like a homecoming than a threat. That morning, he'd seen another name scratched off a list, a friend gone, another from the old world buried. At noon, he ate a stale panino from a corner deli. At 2 p.m., he'd walked past the block where his brother was killed. By 6 o'clock, he found himself standing outside an Italian-Japanese fusion restaurant in Lower Manhattan. He almost turned away. But something, some sliver of unfinished business, pulled him inside. Now, hours later, sitting in the quietest corner of the room, steam rising from a fresh cup of tea poured by a girl who didn't look afraid, Marco began to wonder if fate wasn't finished with him after all. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Sofia Tanaka had just returned to the kitchen when the whisper started. One of the senior servers, Nadia, leaned over the prep counter, eyes wide, hissing, "Did you seriously serve that guy?" Sofia, still balancing the tray with the empty teapot, simply nodded and moved past her. She didn't have the time or energy for another petty workplace storm. She had 4 more tables to check on, bread baskets to reset, and the closing shift to survive before the subway ride home. She didn't think he looked dangerous, that man in the corner. Worn down, yes. Exhausted. But not violent. There was a stillness in him that made her feel more curious than cautious, like he was some old relic from another country left behind on the wrong shelf. Sofia's father would have known what to say about him. "Men like that don't speak often," he used to say, lighting a cigarette out on the fire escape. "But when they do, you better listen." That was before the sickness, before the morphine, before the box of ashes they shipped back from Tokyo with half of his belongings and none of his warmth. He was the one who taught her the value of language, the power it had to either open a door or slam it shut. She returned to the dining room 5 minutes later, clearing water glasses, scanning the room automatically. Her eyes drifted back to table 9, where the man still sat, unmoving, his hand cradling the tea as if it were something sacred. That's when she noticed it. His eyes were locked not on her face, but on her chest, more precisely, on the small silver pendant that hung just beneath her collarbone. Not in a crude way. Not like the other men she served. It was something else. Recognition. The pendant had always been a strange thing to her, slightly too heavy for its size, etched with a design she could never quite identify. 3 lines, curved like fangs, arching around a small stylized wolf's head. She had worn it every day since she turned 15. Her father had given it to her in a velvet box, the last birthday gift before the seizures took his memory and the hospital took the rest. This belonged to someone brave, he'd told her. Now it belongs to you. She was used to people asking about it, customers who thought it looked Celtic or even Japanese. But this man didn't ask right away. He just stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable, the muscles in his jaw tightening. When she finally made her way back to his table, he didn't look up at her face. Instead, he pointed slightly, his voice soft but clear. That pendant. Where did you get it? Sofia paused, caught off guard by the question. Her instinct was to brush it off. She didn't owe him a personal explanation. But something about the way he asked, not intrusive, not aggressive, just quiet. Like the question had been burning a hole in his throat. My father, she said after a moment, carefully placing a new napkin on the table. It was his. From Naples, I think. He never told me much about it, just that it meant something important to him. The man nodded slowly, like he already knew the answer. His fingers twitched against the porcelain cup, knuckles gone pale. There was a beat of silence, and then he said something so softly she almost didn't catch it. He wouldn't have been called Tanaka, would he? Her spine stiffened. It wasn't the name. It was the way he said it, like someone testing ice he already knew would crack. No, she said, cautious now. Tanaka was my mother's name. I use it because it's easier. His name was Leone. Marco swallowed hard. That name, Leone, hit him like a car crash. Alessandro Leone. His second-in-command in Naples. A man who died rather than betray him. A man who used to wear that exact pendant tucked under his shirt like a vow. Marco could still remember handing it to him in the back room of an empty warehouse. You lose this, he'd said, you better be dead. He masked the shock with a slow blink, forcing the tension from his hands. I knew a man by that name, he said carefully. A good man. Sofia's eyes softened a fraction. Everyone says that. But they don't tell me who he was. They act like he just vanished. He didn't respond. Couldn't. He wanted to say, he didn't vanish. He burned. He bled for me. He was the only one who stood his ground the night they came with knives and Molotovs. But those were things you couldn't say in a restaurant with string lights and polished menus. Those were things better left in the grave. Instead, he shifted his gaze back to the pendant and said, he would have been proud of you. Sofia blinked rapidly, caught between politeness and something that felt dangerously close to grief. You didn't even know me, she said, the words barely above a whisper. I didn't need to, he answered, and took another sip of tea. The truth swelled in Marco's throat like heat behind his eyes. This girl, this waitress with soft hands and tired shoes, was the daughter of the man who saved his life. The last flicker of loyalty in a world that had traded honor for money, then burned the ledger. How many years had he spent searching for signs that his past hadn't been a total waste? And here she was, standing in front of him, offering tea like an heir offering peace. He glanced up, realizing she was still watching him. Something in her expression had changed. Do you, she started, then shook her head. Never mind. But he leaned forward, voice low. Do I what? She hesitated. Do you know what that symbol means? Marco hesitated. Every instinct told him to lie. But he couldn't. Not to her. It was part of a family crest. A very old one. From Naples. Used to mean protection. Brotherhood. Vengeance, if necessary. Sofia stared at him, her lips parted slightly. That sounds intense. He nodded. It was. Then she laughed softly, a short breath of nervous relief. Figures. My father was intense. Marco cracked the faintest smile. He had to be. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with invisible things. Shared history. Lost names. Echoes of a world she never knew she came from. From across the room, someone called her name, sharp and impatient. Sofia turned, exhaled, and offered Marco a small apologetic bow. "Duty calls," she said with a crooked smile. "I'll check on you in a bit." Marco gave a slight nod, his eyes still following the pendant as she moved away. He sat there for several more minutes without drinking, without thinking, just remembering. That pendant had once been soaked in blood, his blood. Alessandro had ripped it from around his neck and tied it around Marco's wrist to stop the bleeding as they crawled out of the fire. "For luck," he'd said. Marco never saw him again. The body was never found, but now here was his daughter, serving tea in a country that had no memory of men like them. Her voice, her poise, the careful bow she gave him, it was like someone had pressed rewind on time. And for the first time in years, Marco didn't feel old. He felt accountable. If there was anything left of the Vitale name, it lived in that girl's shadow. Not because of the pendant, but because of the way she carried it. Without even knowing its history, she honored it. And that, he thought, was more loyalty than most men ever managed in full knowledge. He reached into his jacket pocket and thumbed the edge of a worn matchbook. On the inside was the address of a man he had planned to visit tomorrow, a man with answers. A man tied to the betrayal. But now he wondered if his priorities were changing. Because something about that girl's face had reminded him that some bloodlines were still worth protecting. The whispers started even before Sofia could refill the water pitchers. Nadia leaned against the espresso station, lips tight, voice hushed. "You saw him, right? The guy at 9. Another server, Darnell, tilted his chin subtly toward Marco's table. "Neck ink like that? Definitely prison time. You can tell." They didn't know his name, but they knew his kind. Sofia said nothing. She simply picked up a tray and moved past them, forcing her face into neutral calm. Every restaurant had its rumors, ghost stories served between appetizers and dessert. But there was something different about the way people looked at Marco. Not like he was dangerous. Like he had survived something they couldn't understand. Table 9 remained still, quiet, untouched by the usual rhythm of the dining room. Marco hadn't moved much since the pendant conversation. He sat there like a statue, one hand wrapped around the base of his teacup, the other resting lightly against his knee. But his eyes, they shifted constantly. Watching, tracking, measuring. Sofia moved to greet a couple at table 12, but she caught the owner, Salvatore, cutting across the floor toward her. He was a short man with short patience and shorter courtesy. "Tanaka," he hissed, brushing crumbs from his shirt. "You've been spending a lot of time at 9. She glanced at him. "He's a guest." He ordered tea. Salvatore frowned. "I don't care if he orders a gold-plated steak. Stay away from him." She blinked, unsure what to say. "He's not doing anything wrong." Salvatore leaned in, voice lowered. "Guys like that? They don't come in for the food. They're scouting. Marking something. Just serve him and move on." Sofia wanted to argue. But she'd been down this road before, rudeness dressed up as protocol, fear packaged as business sense. "Understood," she said, turning away. But she didn't walk back to Marco. Not yet. Instead, she reset the cutlery at another table, her mind spinning faster than her hands. Marco watched her from the corner of his eye. He hadn't missed the exchange with the boss. He knew what it looked like. Old instincts didn't die. They sharpened in silence. He could see the way the kitchen staff kept their distance. The way the bartender leaned in to whisper something and then snapped back when Marco met his eyes. It reminded him of Naples before it all went dark. There was a time when rooms hushed the moment he entered, not from respect, but anticipation. Everyone braced for something to happen, whether it did or not. Marco didn't speak much back then, but his silence had weight. Now that same silence followed him in exile. Sofia eventually returned to him, placing a small bread plate and a fresh water glass without ceremony. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Marco nodded once. "Fine." But she lingered a moment longer, her brow furrowed. "I was curious," she said, her tone carefully casual. "You're Italian. It's Southern, right? Neapolitan." Marco looked up slowly, expression unreadable. "You have a good ear." She smiled faintly. I'm studying dialects. I know Calabrese from Sicilian. Yours is cleaner. Old school. My father's was like that. Marco said nothing for a moment. Then, without meeting her eyes, he said, most people forget the sound of their roots. You didn't. She blinked at the compliment, unsure how to respond. Then Salvatore's voice echoed from the back, Tanaka. Wine on 7. Sofia flinched. Duty calls, she muttered, and Marco nodded again. She walked away, and he watched her go, slowly reaching into his pocket and pulling out a napkin. With the edge of his finger, he traced the faded ink from an old note he kept folded. Trust no one from the old council. Not even the priest. The dining room was starting to thin out. The Friday rush was over. Candlelight flickered on half-eaten dishes, and wine glasses clinked in half-hearted toasts. But the calm didn't settle in Marco's chest, it only made the tension feel louder. And then the door opened. 2 men walked in, just past 10:30. Plain clothes. Confident. Not tourists. Not regulars. Marco's body tensed without moving. His eyes flicked once. The taller of the two had a jaw like a boxer's and eyes that scanned the room like a fed behind mirrored shades. The other, stockier, with a mess of graying hair, nodded toward the bar, murmuring something to the hostess. She led them to a small table near the middle. But before sitting, the gray-haired one paused. His gaze shifted and locked onto Marco. It lasted only a second. But it was enough. Marco didn't blink. Neither did the man. Then he smiled, too wide, too smooth, and took his seat. Sofia noticed the shift immediately. She caught the stiff lines in Marco's shoulders, the sudden razor-edge calm on his face. Her tray trembled slightly in her hand. Something was wrong. She walked back to the kitchen, trying not to look like she was looking. Meanwhile, the graying man leaned toward his partner and whispered, "Keep an eye on the man at table 9. If it's who I think it is, tonight gets messy." If you were Sofia, would you have ignored the warnings or trusted your gut and kept serving him? Let us know in the comments, and if you're hooked by Sofia and Marco's unfolding story, hit subscribe. The restaurant's rhythm had slowed to a whisper. The clatter of plates gave way to murmurs and half-empty wine glasses. The couple at table 6 left arm in arm, leaving behind a shared tiramisu and a crumpled napkin. The candles flickered lower now, shadows crawling along the polished walls like they were listening in. Sofia wiped down a counter with deliberate slowness, her eyes drawn once more to table 9. Marco still hadn't moved. He sat like a man frozen in deep water, still on the surface, but weighed down by something no one could see. She noticed the teacup tremble slightly in his hand, only once, before he steadied it again. Something had shifted in him. And it wasn't just nerves, it was something older. Familiar. Like he'd felt this tension before. Sofia drifted back toward him, checking in on autopilot. "Still warm enough?" she asked, nodding at the pot. Marco glanced up at her. His eyes were darker now, less guarded, more haunted. "You ever get that feeling," he said, "like someone just locked the door behind you and you didn't hear the click until it was too late?" She blinked, caught off guard by the metaphor. "I guess," she replied carefully. "Depends who's in the room with me." He gave a low chuckle, one that didn't touch his eyes. "Smart girl." A pause. "Your father teach you that?" Her lips parted slightly. "He tried," she said. "He was more of a storyteller than a teacher." Marco leaned back slightly. "What kind of stories?" She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the spare chair across from him. No one was looking. The other servers were on smoke breaks, and Salvatore was arguing with the dishwasher about overtime. "He had this thing," she said, folding her hands. "When I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8. Every time there was thunder, I'd crawl into his bed and ask if the sky was angry. And he'd say," she looked down for a second, smiling softly at the memory. "He'd say, 'Don't worry. The Lupo Nero protects his own.'" Marco's grip on the teacup faltered, the ceramic clinking against the saucer. He caught it quickly, but not fast enough. Sofia's brow creased. "You all right?" He set the cup down carefully, his face unreadable. "Just haven't heard that name in a long time." "I always thought he made it up," she said. "Like a bedtime thing. A made-up night." Marco shook his head slowly. It wasn't made up. Her breath caught. You knew him, didn't you? She asked, voice suddenly quiet. He looked away. I knew men like him, he said. The kind who fought without being asked. The kind who died without being remembered. She studied his face. But you remember him. Marco met her gaze, and for a flicker of a second, he wasn't the man in exile anymore. He was the one who had been left behind. I do, he said simply. Every damn day. Sofia looked down at her lap, unsure how to respond to the grief laced through his voice. Marco cleared his throat, forcing himself upright. You shouldn't sit with me too long, he said. It won't make you popular. I'm not here to win votes, she said. I serve tea and stories. You seem full of both. Marco allowed a faint smile. You have no idea. Then the front door opened again. 2 more guests? No, just movement. Russo was on his feet now, walking table by table, holding what looked like a folded notepad in one hand and a badge clipped loosely to his belt. He played it casual, asking names, checking tabs, pretending to be harmless. But Marco knew better. It was a pressure sweep. Sofia noticed it too. Her gaze flicked back to Russo, then back to Marco. Friend of yours? She asked. Marco didn't answer right away. More like an old song I hoped I'd never hear again. He glanced at the polished glass window and caught Russo's reflection. Slow, circling, patient. Russo stopped at table 6, asked the solo diner there something about a reservation. Smiled. Moved on. He was circling, and everyone knew it. The room had grown tighter somehow, even though nothing physical had changed. Sofia swallowed hard. I should go, she said. Let you finish in peace. But Marco shook his head once. Stay. His voice was firmer now. Please. Russo reached their table 2 minutes later. He stood with his hip cocked to the side and his eyes trained straight on Marco. Evening, he said, voice too polite. Restaurant's doing a little head count tonight. Mind if I check your name? Sofia tensed beside him. Marco didn't blink. I mind, he said softly. Russo's eyebrows lifted. That a no. Marco tilted his head, then leaned back in his chair. Depends who's asking. Russo flashed his badge, not fully, just enough to show the medal. Detective Russo. Organized Crimes Division. Marco didn't react. Russo narrowed his eyes. Name. 1 word. Cold as steel. Marco finally looked up at him. Calm. Controlled. You don't want that answer, detective. The silence that followed was thick and sharp. Sofia felt the air shift. Russo stared at Marco as if trying to peel his skin back and read the name inside his bones. Marco didn't flinch. For a man who had once been hunted across 3 countries, this wasn't fear, it was inevitability. Russo smirked after a beat. Just doing my rounds, he said smoothly, retreating a half step. Enjoy your tea. Then he turned and walked off, but not far. Just to the shadows. Watching. Sofia exhaled, barely realizing she'd been holding her breath. Marco looked back down at his cup. You all right? She whispered. He knows, Marco said. He just doesn't have proof. Knows what? Sofia asked. But he didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the teacup aside and leaned forward. I wasn't supposed to be here tonight, he murmured, but something told me to come. And now I know why. He looked her in the eyes. Your father once stood between me and a bullet. Tonight, you did the same. Russo didn't go far. He leaned by the bar, pretending to study the wine list, but his eyes kept tracking Marco like a wolf waiting for weakness. The badge was gone from his belt now, tucked away, but the threat hadn't left the room. The air had shifted. The staff sensed it, though they didn't understand it, and conversations around the restaurant had thinned into uneasy silence. Marco remained seated, unmoved. He'd played this game before, twice in Milan, once in Istanbul. A man approaches, pretends to be harmless, tests the temperature, then goes in for the kill. But Russo was smarter than the others. He waited. Let the room breathe. He wanted Marco to twitch first. Sofia returned to the table, tray empty, eyes wide. He's still watching, she whispered. Marco didn't respond. He didn't need to. She could feel the tension in the way he held his hands, flat, deliberate, every muscle still. Do you want me to get someone? She asked. He has no jurisdiction here. Marco's eyes flicked to hers. No, he said. You do nothing. If this goes bad, I want you out of the blast zone. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray. I'm not leaving you alone with him. A pause. You're not a man who runs from ghosts. Marco almost smiled at that. No, he murmured. But some ghosts carry guns. Russo pushed off the bar finally, walking back to their table with a half-fake grin. Sorry to disturb you again, he said, voice still calm. Got a tip from Interpol, off the record. A certain individual with a long history of disappearing might be in the area. He turned his gaze to Marco. Figured it couldn't hurt to check. Marco didn't look at him. You came here to make noise, he said. Not to find truth. Russo laughed. You're quick. That's good. You'll need that in custody. Then his tone changed, sharpened like a scalpel. Let's not waste time. Stand up. Sofia stepped forward before Marco could respond. Her body angled protectively, tray set aside. He hasn't done anything, she said firmly. Russo raised an eyebrow. Miss, this is none of your concern. It is, she said. I work here. He's my customer. And you're harassing him. Russo smirked. Do you even know who he is? I know he's been respectful. Quiet. Ordered tea and didn't ask for a damn thing more than basic decency. Her voice was trembling now, but she held her ground. You want to throw someone out? Start with the men who treat waitstaff like servants. Marco didn't move. Didn't blink. But something in his chest unlocked at the sound of her voice. That was how Alessandro used to speak, sharp, protective, unafraid. She didn't know it, but in that moment, Sofia stood exactly where her father once had. Russo leaned in slightly, voice low and venomous. You're defending a ghost, girl. A man with no name and a trail of bodies behind him. Marco finally looked up. Calm. Measured. Unmoving. And then he spoke. Tell your boss in Naples, he said, each word quiet and precise, that the black wolf still breathes. The silence that followed wasn't silence. It was shock. Russo flinched like he'd been slapped. His posture stiffened. His mouth opened, then closed again. He stepped back like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. In that single sentence, everything changed. Marco had named himself, not legally, not openly, but in the only way that mattered. Il Lupo Nero wasn't a myth anymore. He was sitting at table 9, drinking tea. Russo fumbled for his phone, his fingers stiff. He stepped away from the table, turned his back, and whispered into the receiver. Sofia and Marco watched without speaking. The room was frozen. Even Salvatore at the far end of the dining room stood completely still, sensing something far beyond his pay grade unfolding. Russo waited, then nodded, then went pale. He hung up and turned slowly, walking back to Marco with the stiffness of a man who had just been handed a live grenade. Mister, he paused. Corrected himself. Sir, I was told to stand down. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. This isn't my jurisdiction. Marco raised his cup, took a slow sip. It never was. Russo looked at Sofia like he wanted to say something else, some last power move, some parting shot, but found nothing. He turned, walked out the front door, and didn't look back. The moment it closed behind him, the spell broke. Sofia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for minutes. Her knees almost buckled. She reached for the teapot with shaking hands, poured him a fresh cup, and set it down without a word. Marco looked at her. You're not who you said you were, she whispered. I never said who I was, he replied, his voice steady. But you said who I was to you. That's what saved me. Would you have stood between Marco and the badge, knowing what Sofia knows now? Or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this story made your pulse jump, don't forget to subscribe. The moment Russo disappeared through the heavy front doors, the restaurant exhaled, but only for a second. The silence left in his wake wasn't relief. It was the kind that buzzed with suspicion. Conversations flickered on at nearby tables, brittle and clipped, guests glancing nervously toward table 9. Salvatore stormed out from behind the bar, eyes narrowed, jaw set like stone. His shoes slapped the polished floor with the weight of someone certain they were about to reclaim order. He marched up to Sofia, his voice low and sharp enough to cut glass. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, not even looking at Marco. That wasn't some lost tourist, he had a tail. Sofia straightened, though her pulse was still pounding from the standoff. He was being harassed. I wasn't going to let it happen in my section. Salvatore's nostrils flared. You don't have a section, remember? You float. And now you've floated right into a mess I didn't sign off on. Marco didn't move. He just watched them, silent as marble, sipping his tea with the same regal stillness he'd carried through interrogation and insult. But his eyes had changed. They weren't hidden anymore. They were sharp, awake, calculating the moment. Measuring the man. Salvatore jabbed a finger toward the kitchen. You're done, Sofia. Clock out. I don't want to hear another word. Her breath caught. Are you serious? Dead serious, he snapped. You brought attention we don't need, insulted a law officer, and made the whole floor nervous. He finally looked at Marco. And let this guy camp out all night like he owns the place. Marco stood. It wasn't abrupt. It wasn't threatening. But it was like watching a mountain rise after centuries of sleep. The room went still. Every patron, every waiter, every kitchen hand froze mid-motion. Chairs stopped creaking. Cutlery stopped clinking. Even the wine seemed to stop pouring in someone's glass nearby. Marco stepped away from his chair with a grace that contradicted his age and posture. The coat fell open, revealing the stark black of his tailored shirt beneath, nothing flashy, but precise, like a uniform for a man who needed no emblem to be feared. His voice, when it came, was velvet-wrapped iron. She's the only one in this room, Marco said, who still knows what respect means. Salvatore stared at him, stunned. Excuse me? You heard me. Marco's tone didn't rise. It didn't have to. It commanded. She served with honor. She showed restraint in the face of cruelty, loyalty in the face of fear. You, on the other hand, he let the rest hang, heavy as thunder. Sofia didn't speak. She couldn't. Her heart was hammering so hard it drowned out the hum of the overhead lights. Salvatore looked around the room for someone, anyone, to support him. But the other staff had gone completely still, eyes wide. Even Nadia, who never passed up a chance to undermine Sofia, had taken a step back. Marco reached into his inner coat pocket, slow and smooth. Salvatore flinched. But all Marco pulled out was a card. Matte black. Edgelit. The kind of card that didn't ask for limits, because the man holding it didn't recognize any. He placed it on the counter between them. From tonight, he said, voice low and absolute, this restaurant is under her name. Gasps cracked through the stillness like dropped plates. Sofia's mouth fell open, her lips shaping a protest that never made it past her throat. Salvatore stammered. What are you talking about? You can't just, I can, Marco said, his eyes narrowing. And I have. He turned toward the kitchen. Two men had appeared from the back hallway, black suits, quiet shoes, the kind of presence that screamed trained but invisible. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. One held a small envelope. The other carried a folded file with deeds, documents, and a notary stamp already fresh. Salvatore backed up a step. This is a joke. What? You think you can walk in here and buy the place out from under me? I bought it 6 years ago, Marco said flatly. Through a holding company called Vesuvia Partners. You never read the fine print in your lease. He stepped closer. You've been working in my building, in my house, while treating people like dirt beneath your feet. The owner paled visibly. But his voice cracked. You can't, you fired her, Marco interrupted. And I'm firing you. Salvatore's voice broke. Please, I've got kids. Marco's jaw tightened. Then you should have learned how to treat people like someone else's kids. The two men in suits stepped forward. Escort him out, Marco said, barely above a whisper. They didn't drag him. They didn't shout. They simply turned him by the elbow and walked him through the room as every guest turned away or stared or whispered behind linen napkins. And then he was gone. The brass doors shut with a sound like judgment itself. Sofia stood frozen, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and panic. Marco turned back to her slowly. The room still hadn't resumed its rhythm. No one dared speak first. He reached out and gently pushed the black card across the counter toward her. Your name, he said quietly, belongs on the deed now. And on the door. Sofia stared at him, blinking. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this? Marco's eyes softened. Because your father saved my life, he said. And you just reminded me that I'm still worth saving. The cold hit Sofia the moment the brass doors closed behind her. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, breath catching in the crisp midnight air, the silence of the street a stark contrast to the charged storm still lingering inside. Her heart was still racing, not from fear, but from the impossible weight of what had just happened. A man with a name whispered like a myth had just handed her a key, a future, and a question she hadn't yet figured out how to answer. The stars above the city blinked through the haze, watching. Marco stood by the curb, coat buttoned against the wind, hands in his pockets. He wasn't watching her, he was watching the street like it might speak. His posture was still regal, but there was something else now too. A weariness. Not just the tiredness of a long life, but the ache of memory. The kind that sits behind the eyes and weighs every breath. She walked toward him slowly, the sound of her steps muted against the pavement. For a moment, she didn't speak. Neither did he. But finally, softly, she asked, "Why did you really come here tonight?" Marco didn't turn, but she saw his breath catch. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a cigarette from a silver case and lit it with a match that flared gold in the wind. He took a long drag before replying. "I came to visit the ghosts," he said simply. "Some men visit graves. I came here." Sofia frowned, confused. "Ghosts?" Marco nodded. "This block, this building, the foundation was once owned by my family. Long before it became risotto and imported sake. Back then, it was a warehouse. Quiet. Plain. But it was the heart of everything I built." He finally turned toward her, the smoke curling around his face like fog. "Everything changed one night," he continued. "My consigliere betrayed me. Sold me out to men who wanted my seat, but not my code." His voice stayed steady, but the pain lived just under it. "My brother was ambushed right here, in this alley behind the building. Shot 7 times. I was supposed to die too." Sofia took a step closer, listening, drawn in. "But you didn't." "No," Marco said. "I didn't. Alessandro, your father, warned me. Got me out before they could finish the job. He stayed behind." His eyes darkened. "He died for me." Her breath caught in her throat. "You're sure?" Marco nodded. "I'm as sure as I am standing here. The pendant you wear, it's not just an heirloom. It was his signal. A crest we only gave to men who swore blood loyalty." His voice lowered. "And your father never broke his oath." She looked down at the silver wolf around her neck. It had always felt heavy, but now it felt sacred. Like something alive. Something earned. "I didn't know," she whispered. "He never told me." "He wouldn't have," Marco replied. "Men like him didn't talk about the lives they walked away from. He left the blood behind to give you peace." He flicked the cigarette to the curb. "But sometimes, peace leaves before the man does." They stood in silence for a moment, the night wrapping around them in soft wind and memory. "So why now?" Sofia asked. "Why show yourself tonight? Why reveal who you are?" Marco's gaze didn't waver. "Because I've spent 3 years hiding. And tonight, a waitress with fire in her eyes reminded me that hiding isn't the same as surviving." Sofia looked away, her jaw tightening. "I'm not a symbol. I'm not some legacy project." He smiled faintly. "No, you're smarter than that. You're also the first person in a long time who looked at me like a man and not a monster." The words landed harder than she expected. She wrapped her arms around herself, unsure whether it was the cold or the truth that made her shiver. Marco watched her carefully, then took a step closer. "I don't want to own you," he said quietly. "I want to ask you." She looked up. "Ask me what?" "Would you consider working with me?" he said. "Not for me. With me." The distinction sat heavy between them. "You have a name that means something. A bloodline tied to mine. And more importantly, you have a heart your father would have followed into fire." Sofia laughed once, dry and disbelieving. "I'm a grad student who lives off coffee and crackers. What could you possibly need from me?" Marco stepped even closer, his eyes sharp now. "I need someone who hasn't forgotten what loyalty looks like. Someone who still believes respect is a language worth speaking. She stared at him. And what, exactly, does working with you look like? His response was quiet. Restoration. Redemption. A return, not to the old ways, but to the meaning behind them. I want to rebuild something better than what I left behind. And I want you to help me do it. Sofia exhaled slowly, her breath misting in the air. And if I say no? Marco shrugged. Then I leave tomorrow. You keep the restaurant. The card. The name. I disappear again. And maybe that's the end of it. And if I say yes, she asked. He gave the faintest smile. Then we start with tea. And we see what else can be rebuilt. Sofia looked up at the sky, blinking away the wet at the corners of her eyes. The stars above were faint, but they were still there. Still watching. Just like the ghosts. She looked back at Marco, then nodded once. I don't promise obedience, she said. Just honesty. Marco's smile deepened. That's all I've ever needed. They sat on the edge of a concrete planter, just off the sidewalk, where a single strip of moonlight broke through the city haze. Sofia clutched a paper cup of chamomile tea Marco had insisted they grab from a late-night vendor. Her hands were still shaking, but not from the cold. It was the weight of everything he'd said, everything she hadn't known. Marco hadn't pushed her for answers, hadn't tried to explain away the silence. He just sat beside her, still as the stone beneath them. I didn't expect to talk about him tonight, she said quietly. Not like this. Marco nodded, his eyes locked on the streetlight flickering across the pavement. Neither did I, he murmured. But the past doesn't knock. It kicks the door in. Sofia looked at him, the faintest trace of fear still sitting in her voice. Were you close? You and my father. Marco turned to her, the light catching the edge of a memory in his eyes. He wasn't just close, he said. He was my brother. Not by blood, but by the kind of loyalty you don't get twice in one life. He leaned back slightly, his shoulders rolling as if shaking off years. We met when I was 24. I was nobody back then, just a soldier running numbers through the docks of Naples. He was the one who saw something in me before anyone else did. Marco chuckled once, a low sound soaked in regret. I used to be all fire. He was water. Calmed me down, cooled my temper. Kept me from burning everything. Sofia clutched her tea tighter, eyes glistening. I wish I had known him like that. Marco nodded slowly. You did. That strength? That quiet kindness you have? It's his. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather envelope, worn at the corners. There's something you should see. Sofia hesitated, then reached out, her fingers brushing the rough leather as she took it from him. She undid the flap slowly, careful not to tear anything. Inside was a photograph, creased, faded, but intact. Two men stood in front of a rust-red car, both laughing. One had a cigarette in his mouth and an arm slung casually over the other's shoulder. That's us, Marco said, the ghost of a smile flickering. Me and Alessandro. 1997, right after a warehouse deal nearly went sideways. We celebrated with espresso and a fist fight in an alley. He won. Sofia let out a broken laugh, the sound cracked by emotion. He never mentioned any of this. He wouldn't have, Marco said gently. He didn't want that life following you. He wanted you clean. Safe. That was his final oath. She stared at the photo, trying to find the father she remembered in the man smiling beside Marco. And she did, there in the eyes, in the crooked grin, in the way he stood like he had nothing to prove. So what happened? She asked, voice barely a whisper. The night of the betrayal? Marco's jaw tensed. It was a setup, he said. Someone inside tipped them off. We had a meeting scheduled, neutral ground. Or so we thought. His voice dropped. But there's no such thing as neutral ground when money's on the table and blood's in the water. Russo? Sofia asked. Marco nodded slowly. He was on payroll. Not mine. The others. A pause. He used to work for my second-in-command. A man I trusted. A man who stabbed me with a smile. Sofia blinked, processing the implication. So the cop who tried to arrest you was part of the same network that killed my father? Marco looked at her, something solemn and hard in his expression. Yes. And that's why I didn't shoot him tonight. He took a breath. Because that would have been too easy. The cold crept deeper into Sofia's sleeves, but she didn't feel it. The fire burning in her chest eclipsed everything else. I had no idea, she whispered, voice cracking. All this time, I thought my father just died in Tokyo. A stroke. A story my mother barely knew how to tell. Marco looked at her gently. Sometimes the lie is mercy. Sometimes it's silence born of love. He tapped the photo in her hands. But he never forgot. And neither did I. She was crying now, quietly, without sobs. Just slow, steady tears that blurred the image of her father into water. Marco didn't touch her. He didn't try to fix it. He just sat beside her, offering the only thing a man like him could offer, truth. After a while, she wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her coat. He died protecting your family, she said, as if needing to say it aloud. Yes, Marco confirmed. And now, he looked at her. Let me protect his. Sofia's breath hitched. The weight of the words settled into the hollow left behind by grief. Not a replacement. Not an apology. A vow. You don't owe me anything, she said softly. I do, Marco replied. Not because of what he did, but because of what you've done. You reminded me what honor feels like. What loyalty looks like without expectation. She looked down at the photo again, then folded it carefully, placing it back inside the envelope. What now? She asked. Now, Marco said, standing, we go forward. Together. Like wolves. Do you think it's ever right to hide the truth from family to protect them, or does every legacy deserve to be told? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe in honoring the past to build the future, hit subscribe. The first thing Sofia did was take down the mirrored sign. The gilded scepter had gleamed too bright, too cold, a name that had never fit the soul of the place. Marco watched from across the street as she replaced it with a new plaque, Lupo Nero. The letters were carved in dark brass, understated and deliberate. Beneath it, in smaller script, was a phrase in Italian, Onora cio che ti ha fatto cadere, e cio che ti ha fatto rialzare. Honor what broke you and what made you rise. Inside, the air smelled different. Less like money, more like memory. Gone were the sterile white linens and overpriced wine lists. In their place were soft wooden tables, fresh-cut herbs in glass jars, and a quiet playlist of Italian strings and jazz. The menu had changed too, a merging of past and present, sea bass beside soba, gnocchi beside pickled plum. Every dish told a story now. And Sofia was finally writing hers. Managing a restaurant wasn't what she'd planned. Her thesis sat half-finished on a cluttered desk, the stack of overdue rent notices now replaced by staff schedules and vendor calls. But under Marco's quiet mentorship, she learned. Not just the logistics, the margins, the invoices, the rules of the trade, but the unspoken things. How to read a guest's silence. How to fire someone with dignity. How to lead without lifting your voice. Marco didn't hover. He was there, always, but in the background, like an old wolf keeping watch over a clearing. He'd come in around noon, check the books, speak softly with suppliers. Then he'd retreat to his back booth with a glass of Amaro and a newspaper, letting Sofia take the floor. The regulars noticed. The ones who came back, week after week, saw the change not just in the space, but in her. Sofia had gone from floater to foundation. And yet, not everything stayed quiet. The cherry blossoms bloomed late that year. Marco said it was a good omen, something about delayed beauty having longer roots. Sofia didn't know what that meant, not really, but it stuck with her. The small courtyard out back, once used for trash bins and cigarette breaks, had been swept clean and planted with low lights and white-pink petals. She spent her early mornings there, sketching out new concepts for a wine pairing board, drinking espresso alone before the kitchen noise began. It was on one of those mornings that Russo returned. He didn't knock. He walked straight into the courtyard, hands in his coat, eyes shaded behind mirrored glasses. Sofia stood, startled, nearly dropping her mug. Behind her, Marco had already emerged from the side door, his presence as steady as a heartbeat. Russo held up one hand, not as a threat, but a flag. No games, he said. I didn't come for that. Marco didn't blink. You already played them, he replied. And lost. Russo sighed. I'm not here to settle scores. I'm here to pass along an offer. Marco raised an eyebrow, almost amused. They want a truce? Russo nodded once. They say, enough blood. Enough memory. They want to cut the past loose and call it square. Sofia said nothing, but her hands were clenched tight by her sides. Marco stepped forward, slowly, until the morning sun carved a line between him and Russo. I didn't come back to play their games, he said, voice even. I came to build something new. Russo tilted his head. That's not how they see it. I don't care how they see it, Marco said. Let them choke on their ghosts. I'm done answering to men who once sold honor for power. There was a pause, quiet except for the soft rustle of the cherry blossoms above. I had to ask, Russo muttered. No, Marco corrected. You had to deliver. That's different. Russo hesitated, then nodded once. They'll take your silence as an answer. Good, Marco said, already turning away. But Russo added, almost gently, they know about her. That stopped him. Sofia froze. Marco's back stiffened. He didn't turn, but his voice dropped into something lethal. If they touch her, they won't, Russo cut in. They know better. But you should too. This piece you're building? It's not invisible. You'd do well to protect its edges. With that, he left. Marco didn't speak for several long seconds. Sofia finally moved beside him, her voice low. They really see me as a threat? Marco shook his head. No. They see you as proof that I'm still alive. Later that day, Sofia found a sealed envelope waiting for her in the office. Inside were legal documents, transfer of ownership, title registration, a letter from Marco. The final page simply read, "This is yours now. I just needed someone to remind me what family looks like." She read it twice, then sat with it in her lap, unable to move. That night, the restaurant was full. No one spoke of betrayals or offers or ghosts. They just ate and laughed under a low golden light, with the hum of music and the clink of wine glasses echoing against the walls. But Marco watched from his usual table in the corner, his gaze resting not on the plates, but on her. The wolf had returned to the forest. But the moon now had its own light. The new sign gleamed softly in the spring dusk. Lupo y Luna cast its golden glow across the sidewalk, the brass edges catching the evening light just enough to feel regal, not flashy. Inside, the restaurant hummed with quiet elegance, white blossoms in clay vases, hand-carved menus tied with silk ribbon, candlelight flickering like old memories remembered. A string trio played in the corner, not for applause, but ambience. The walls had been repainted a warmer shade, the kind of color that looked like it had always belonged there. It was the grand reopening, but there were no press releases. No celebrities. Just loyal guests, old friends, and new faces drawn in by word of mouth and the promise of something genuine. The tables were full, but nothing felt rushed. Conversations flowed with grace, wine was poured with care, and laughter didn't bounce, it bloomed. Sofia moved through the space like she'd always been meant to lead it. Her hair was up, her blouse simple, her steps confident. No apron tonight, just a soft gray silk dress with sleeves rolled to the elbows and a pendant resting against her collar. The silver wolf still hung close to her heart. But now it wasn't a secret she carried. It was a symbol she honored. She greeted guests in both Italian and Japanese, weaving through tables with the fluid rhythm of someone who had lived in both cultures without ever quite belonging to either until now. Her staff looked to her naturally, not out of fear but out of trust. She corrected gently, praised often, and made sure no one poured their own water unless they wanted to. She hadn't just inherited a building. She had redefined it. In the very back, tucked into the corner where light and shadow met, Marco watched. He wore a crisp black suit, no tie, no flash. His silver hair was combed neatly, his hands folded loosely around a glass of Amaro. Most didn't notice him. That's how he preferred it. This was not his show. Not anymore. He listened to the music. Watched the flow of the room. The way Sofia leaned in slightly when guests spoke, the way she touched the shoulder of a nervous busboy just once to steady his nerves, the way her smile held at the edges like she meant every second of it. She had taken the bones of an empire and given it a heartbeat. And Marco il Lupo Nero, once the shadow on every dock in Naples, sat back with something dangerously close to peace. He thought about that night, not so long ago, when he'd entered this restaurant in silence. When no one saw him but her. Not the tattoos, not the shadows. Just the man. The tired one. The lost one. And then came one word. One language. Buonasera. He could still hear the way she'd said it. Not out of habit, but choice. A soft greeting in a language no one else had used in years, not with sincerity. It had reached into the hollow place inside him and lit a spark. Not a flame. Just enough light to remind him he hadn't disappeared. That word had saved him. Not because of what it meant, but because of how it was said. From the corner of the room, he took a sip of his drink and watched as Sofia stopped to kneel by an elderly woman's table. The woman was struggling with the wine list. Sofia crouched beside her, spoke softly, and then smiled with such kindness the whole table relaxed like a wave had passed over them. This was what legacy looked like when it chose to be tender instead of ruthless. He didn't need her to be a warrior. She had already proven that. What mattered now was that she had become something rarer, a steward. Not of his name, but of its meaning. He had tried to build an empire with fear. She had rebuilt it with respect. Just then, the brass door opened. A man stepped inside, maybe 70, maybe 80. His coat was threadbare. His posture was proud. But the hostess didn't see him right away. The servers didn't glance his way. He stood just inside, forgotten. Marco leaned forward slightly, heart tightening. A test again? A memory repeating? Then he saw her. Sofia noticed. She paused mid-sentence at another table, turned, and caught sight of the man. Her eyes softened. She handed a wine list to the guest beside her and excused herself. She walked across the room, weaving through silk and glass and music. The man seemed unsure, ready to leave. But before he could turn, Sofia stopped in front of him, smile gentle, voice warm. Buonasera, signore. Vuol un tavolo per uno. Good evening, sir. Would you like a table for one? The man blinked, surprised. Then smiled. A real one. Marco closed his eyes for a moment. That one word, said again with sincerity, without agenda, had done it again. Not just to him. Not just to this place. But to the world around it. Buonasera. The empire wasn't his anymore. And that was exactly how it should be. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.